Hi, my name is Seth Jones. I'm an associate professor at Middle Tennessee State University. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about why a summit on mathematics education should be thinking about data science, both inside the mathematics classroom and outside the math classroom. Thanks everybody for joining my session today. And I also want to say thank you to the summit organizers for inviting me to participate in this summit on mathematics education. Like I said, my name is Seth Jones. I'm an associate professor at Middle Tennessee State University. And I've been working in math education for over 20 years. That began with an undergraduate degree from Tennessee Technological University in secondary math education, and then 5 years of teaching high school math, 1 year of teaching middle school math. And these teaching experiences happened across diverse contexts, from rural to urban settings, from communities without many resources to communities with way more resources than what they need. And after that, I went on to graduate school. There I began to think a little bit more about the role of data and statistics in math classes. And I conducted research with Dr. Rich Lair in middle grades on how students talked about data and statistics. And after graduate school, I worked as a research scientist on a team of math education researchers led by Dr. Jer Comfrey. And there I helped to create digital tools for middle school math teachers to help them better understand student thinking in their math classes. Since 2016, I've been at Middle Tennessee State University working in STEM education. And the reason why I share all this is to communicate that what I'm going to be sharing today, the ideas I'm going to be talking about, the claims I'm going to be making, have all been shaped by these experiences across multiple decades of working in math education. My research in math education on teaching and learning about data has occurred in middle school classes, where teachers were using an innovative curriculum called data modeling. These middle school classes were mathematics classes, but it's also occurred in spaces outside of math classes. It's occurred in undergraduate science classes, where I've collaborated with science educators to study how undergraduates can come to understand and use data and statistics in ways that are consistent with the way scientists use them in their scientific investigations. And more recently, I've worked in middle school science classes to help science and math teachers in middle grades better coordinate their teaching related to data so that students might have a more coherent learning experience and draw on ideas and practices across disciplinary boundaries in schools to study the world around them. And across all of these settings, what's motivated me is the question, how are we equipping teachers and students to think critically and creatively about mathematizing the world with data? So that's me, and that's the experiences that are going to be influencing what I share today. And from this point forward, there's three things that I want to do. First, I want to share the motivation for why mathematics education must think about data science. And as I do this, spoiler alert, I'm going to claim that we have to think about this both inside and outside the math classes. That might not be a surprise given what I've already said. Number two, I want to talk just a little bit about the kinds of experiences that kids need in math classes. They're going to be equipped to think well with data. And then last, I want to end by sharing some thoughts about how math education might work to support students outside of math classes as well. So let's get started with the motivation for why we need to be thinking about data science. I want to start by asking you to examine these data visualizations from the New York Times and consider what you notice. If this were live, I would ask you to share your observations, but since it's recorded, I'll give you about 30 seconds to look on your own. And what I want you to do is just look at these data visualizations and see, what do you notice? Okay, just a few more seconds here. Now, like I said, I would love to hear what you noticed. Since it's a recording, let me share a few things that I noticed that maybe you noticed also. First, there's data here from 6 different U.S. cities. Second, these data are minimum daily temperatures. So not high temperatures, but just how hot does it stay at night when you get to your low temperature. Each city here shows 2 distributions. one in gray from the 1960s and another from the 2020s. The data from the 2020s is brightly colored. And in all of these cities, those data, that distribution is shifted to the right. There's a big difference between both distributions in all cities in terms of the percent of the distribution in abnormally hot or abnormally cold. And just think about this. A reader is expected to see things like this when they look at these data visualizations. And they're expected to see many other important things in order to make some kind of inference about what any of this means. Okay, I want to do the same exercise here with a second visualization. Again, I would love to hear what your ideas are about this. Since this is a recording, I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to look at it yourself, and then I'll share some things that I'm noticing in it that maybe map onto what you noticed too. Okay, I've got about 30 seconds now. So I wonder what you noticed. Did you notice that this representation has data across time from 2018 till early 2023? Did you focus on that black line that kind of resembles a sine function? Did you see that that's something the CDC calls threshold? Did you wonder what that meant? Did you focus on the red line that the CDC calls percent of deaths due to PIC? I'll let you know that does mean pneumonia, influenza, and COVID. Did you notice that it seems to be tracking right along with the threshold line until early 2020? And that since then it stayed pretty well above it through the early days of 2023? Did you pay attention to the purple areas called COVID-coded deaths? Or are you an eagle eye and you spotted the orange influenza-coded deaths and try to understand what that meant? Did you wonder what the numbers on the scales mean? The reason why I'm starting here is because as mathematics educators, we need to be honest and ask ourselves, if we have the responsibility to make sure as many people as possible can make sense of data like these, then what competencies do they need in order to do that? Because those competencies, I can tell you, research has shown are not natural for any of us. Research has made it clear we are all prone to think in terms of discrete events and not aggregate events, and that we have a hard time conceptualizing aggregate distributions and reasoning with variable data. We also have a really hard time with uncertainty. That's why you'll often hear comments like these in the public discourse about these data. But wait just a second. Southern California had historic snowstorms in 2023. How can people say things are warming up? Or listen, people have always died of the flu. Is COVID really all that different from that? In order to reason well with data, students must be supported to understand what it means to mathematize the world. They must be able to reason about and explain variation in data, and they must be able to justify explanations of data. And in addition to all of that, they've got to be able to critically engage with others that are making claims doing those same things. So, what would that look like exactly? Well, here what I'm going to do is draw from Lair and English and Lair and Schabel to describe the game students have to have experiences with and understand in order to think well with data. First, they need to understand what it means to ask a question. Now, this is not a particularly mathematical goal. We ask questions all the time about all sorts of things. But to build a data model, you've got to go on from your question to consider just how am I conceptualizing this phenomenon and how am I going to mathematize it? What do I mean by temperature? What do I mean by threshold? For that matter, what does it mean to be a death coded as COVID or influenza? Then you have to think about how you'd measure that idea in some way to give you any kind of valid information. You've got to make all sorts of decisions about where and when to use those measurement strategies, and only then do you end up with something that you might call a sample. But your work then isn't even close to over, because that sample is going to have all sorts of variability. So you've got to make choices about how to visualize your data, about how to measure parts of the data with statistics, and maybe even how to build a model of data to inform your understanding of the sampling variability and to make inferences. And it's after a whole host of decisions, many of them mathematical, across all those steps, that you end up with some kind of explanation about what's going on in that data. And what's more, even that explanation always leads to more questions. So the whole process starts over again. That means this is a really hard educational problem, especially if we want students to look at data visualizations and wonder what kinds of decisions people made at each of these points when they weren't a part of that process. And none of this can be routinized for students, because every day there's new forms of data and new kinds of questions coming out. That's why we have a new phrase called data science. Many of these new forms of data don't conform to methods that people have been using for a long time to analyze data. So students need to know much more than how to use well-established methods for analyzing data. They need to be educated in a way that supports them to think creatively and critically in a dynamic, data-rich environment. Now, these ideas have been talked about for a long time in math education, and it's worth saying at this point, in this whole talk, I am blurring the lines between mathematics and statistics as disciplines. I'm doing that intentionally, though, because virtually all of the data science or statistics instruction that students experience in K-12 classes happens in what we call math classes. So people have talked about how children shouldn't only learn the tools of statistics, they should learn to carry out statistical investigations in creative and critical ways, that children need to be supported to see data distribution and statistics as tools to generate knowledge, that probability needs to be integrated with these lessons so that students can understand the role of probability in making inferences, and that in all of this, students need to understand that all these tools are just tools to make sense of the world in light of variable data. This is also a topic of conversation from other STEM disciplines. For example, our colleagues in science education have similar goals for their students to develop competencies in scientific practice. They want children to not only learn what scientists know, but how they know. They want children to understand sort of the epistemic culture of science, how scientists generate knowledge. And not just how, but for themselves to have a grasp of that practice, to be able to participate in that practice in some meaningful way, and to make claims in the midst of a variable world in ways that scientists would recognize and be able to engage with. So at this point, you might be thinking, this is a celebration talk. Yay, everyone cares about this. They're all talking about it, but not so fast. Data science practices, like any practice, only make sense if the ideas and practices across all these disciplinary boundaries in schools make sense in light of each other and in light of the investigation that a student is carrying out. So this means students have to develop significant interdisciplinary knowledge across STEM disciplines. And that means data science is an interdisciplinary STEM problem. But I just want to pause here to acknowledge that when people use STEM to describe something happening in schools, they almost always use it as if it's a synonym with engineering design. STEM projects almost always look like engineering design projects. And we know what can happen to the mathematics in those STEM engineering tasks. Oftentimes, they can be lost altogether. Students might not even have to grapple with the mathematics very much. I think for this reason, math education has to make it clear that data science is a fundamental STEM practice, just like engineering design is. You can't ignore that. And in data science, you can't ignore the important mathematical ideas and practices that students have to be able to reason with. Just think about a seemingly simple question about plant growth. Something like, how tall do these plants grow? In order to answer that and to use data to answer it, you've got to think about a whole host of ideas. You got to think about your question, how you're going to generate a sample, like I said a few slides ago, how you're going to measure things, what kind of sample variability you're going to have to deal with. You're going to have to coordinate that with things that you know about plant growth, maybe things like genetics. You're going to have to develop some kind of shared protocol if you're going to be combining your data with other people who are measuring these plants. Then how are we going to visualize these data? What kinds of statistics are we going to use? How are we going to deal with sampling variability? How are we going to model the probability structure of all that variability? And what happens in schools is that you have two different places, something called math class and something called science class. And even though all of these ideas need to be coordinated in some coherent way to answer that question, how tall do these plants grow? What happens in schools is that they get separated across math class and science class. And then somehow we expect students to be the ones to make the connections and build coherence across these things. And this is a really hard problem because we know that it's hard for students to make those connections, and we know that it's hard for teachers to collaborate across disciplines. So, is it really any surprise that people have a hard time thinking with data? It's a hard problem. If we want to educate people to honestly engage with data science, then math education must seriously consider two things. First, how can we support this inside the math class? What are the kinds of experiences students need? What kinds of training do teachers need to be able to provide those learning experiences? But it has to be more than that, because this is not just a mathematics problem. This is an interdisciplinary STEM problem. So, as mathematics educators, the second question we have to ask ourselves is, how can we support it outside of the math class? And even what responsibility do we have to support these ways of thinking outside of the math class? Because we know that it's not enough for students to learn an idea in a math class context and then to put the responsibility on their shoulders to make the connections across other STEM disciplines where it makes sense. So, what I'd like to do is next to give a few ideas about learning opportunities inside math classes. If we're going to support students to think well with data, we have to help them learn how to build and share and critique and revise data models, and then to use them to generate increasingly sophisticated explanations of where all the variability in their data comes from. That means that students need opportunities to create novel approaches to analyzing data. As I said before, we need to prepare them to deal with new forms of data. So they need to understand what it means to generate an analysis plan, to generate a method, to compare it to someone else's method, and to justify the choices that they've made. Second, students need opportunities to share and discuss these approaches so that they can learn what it means to critique someone else's, to compare it to theirs, to consider the trade-offs between the two. And third, teachers need to support students to connect their novel approaches to mathematical ideas and practices that we know are important for them to be able to grapple with if they're going to think about data. So let me share an example of how we support this in math classes. And what I'm drawing on here is a curriculum called Data Modeling, meant for middle grades math classes, that was first developed by Rich Lair. So the way that these curriculum materials start is we first ask students to each measure the length of some common object. It could be the width of the room, the perimeter of a table, the width of an arm span of the teacher, or even a big stuffed animal in the classroom. And what happens is that since we give students small rulers that have to be iterated many, many times, lots of variability is generated just from the measurement mistakes that they make. We use that, though, as a learning opportunity. We give students opportunities to invent data displays, data visualizations, to make sense of these measurements and try and see, is there any way we can use our measurements, even though we have all kinds of variabilities, is there any way we can use them to answer the question, how long is that object? We give them opportunities to think about the shape of the distribution and then to come up with things that we call statistics, what students often call a best guess method. So an algorithm someone else could follow that would help them determine what the best guess, our best guess of what the true length of that object is. But we also give them chances to think about measures of variability and how you might measure variability, and give them opportunities to come up with novel approaches to measuring variability. So let me show you a little bit about what kids' thinking looks like in these settings. Right after they measure the same object, students are often shocked to learn that they did not come up with the same measurements. Students often draw on their measurement experiences to generate a list of sources of variability. Again, to start to get a sense for what it means to explain that variability. This often includes mistakes they made, but also many mistakes that they saw their classmates make. But this variability in measurement mistakes often leads many students to look to their teacher as the one with the agency to know the true length. This is not surprising. As you can see here, this is an example of a teacher that's regularly pushing back on this way of thinking. When students look to her for the true answer of how long the object is, she tells them regularly, hey, all I can do is measure like you can. We need your data to answer these questions. Now, this might all seem like a waste of time. All this measurement error, all these ideas about where it came from, but these are valuable experiences for students to understand that even mathematizing something as simple as the length of an object involves rampant variability and uncertainty. And we use that as an opportunity to motivate something like data visualization. So we give students a chance to create innovative ways to display these data. What we say is create a way to display these data or visualize these data so that it would help someone answer the question, just how long is that object? Here on the slide, I've got 4 different kid creations. These are all representative of the kinds of things that kids often come up with. And as you can see, they oftentimes don't replicate conventions like histograms or dot plots, kinds of things that we have in our standards. But again, this is not a waste of time. It is important for them to experience what it means to make decisions and justify those decisions about how to visualize data. Each of these decisions determines what can be seen and what can't be seen in the data. Because remember, it's not just the ability to create a histogram or a dot plot that we want students to develop. We want them to be able to think critically and creatively about new forms of data that often require new forms of data visualization. So they need to know what it means to create a data visualization, to compare it to different design choices, and to justify their choices. This actually supports students to shift their authority in their claims. They move from looking to the teacher to, once they start to create these visualizations, they recognize, hey, wait just a second. Now there are things in our data to help us answer the question of how long is that object. For example, this is a student response. This is after a teacher asked the class if 152 centimeters could be the true value of the length of the object. Notice that this student didn't only disagree, but started to use the aggregate structure that became visible from their data visualization to justify why she disagrees. There's way more votes against just your one vote. So the teacher has moved from being the authority to just one more measurement. And this student is looking at aggregate structure to justify her claim. And this teacher also helped students to see that their novel data visualizations actually made use of lots of foundational ideas in lots of data visualizations in the world. Students grappled with ideas about order, ideas about frequency, ideas about grouping, how to group their data, ideas about scale, whether or not to use a consistent measurement scale. And these each showed and sometimes hid different things in their data. So the question we have to ask ourselves that I keep bringing up is, are we supporting our students to think critically and creatively with data in our math classes. Okay, for the remaining time, I want to talk a little bit about some ideas about how mathematics education might inform mathematical thinking outside of mathematics classes. And I just want to stop here for a second. At each transition point, I've had this same image on the screen. And I wonder, when you look at this image, do you think the student is in a mathematics class or in a not mathematics class? I'll give you just a second to look. Because I intentionally chose this image to highlight how when students are involved in these investigations, like I said earlier, they are having to coordinate interdisciplinary ideas across disciplinary boundaries that get built in schools. And for them, those boundaries aren't real. And an image like this illustrates the fact that oftentimes it blurs whether or not they're doing mathematics, what we might call mathematics in a school, or science in a school, or some other STEM discipline in a school. So that's why mathematics education research has to think about how are we helping students coordinate their questions and investigations with mathematical and statistical ideas across disciplinary boundaries in schools. Students need opportunities to see the mathematics that they learned in their math class as relevant to understanding the world around them. Students need opportunities to use their developing mathematical, statistical competencies to generate knowledge themselves about the world around them. And teachers across disciplines can support students to connect their approaches and their ideas to mathematical ideas and practices that they've learned about across disciplinary boundaries. So as math educators, we need to think more about how our work helps teachers and students coordinate with other disciplines. I'm just going to share one example of what our group is working on. We've been working to help coordinate sixth grade math standards with sixth grade science standards. And we've co-designed a sequence of investigations with teachers where in math class, students learn about data visualization. I showed a little peek of what that looks like earlier. Then over in their science class, we've coordinated investigations and explicitly built support to help students use those ideas to explore their local schoolyard ecology. Back in their math class, we design opportunities for students to learn about descriptive statistics, and then we create opportunities for them to take those ideas over into their science class to study how plants grow using a model organism called Wisconsin fast plants over in their science class. Students in their science investigation grappled with how to mathematize a new phenomenon in ways that would create some kind of sensible measurement scale. These students had a stable procedure. They all assumed that if they measured the coverage of all the different species within a square quadrat, that all those values would add up to 100. But then this is an example here of a question from a researcher that was co-teaching the class. This is an example of a question that prompted a new problem. What do we do when these species overlap each other? These types of measurement issues continued to come up for these students, and it created opportunities for them to reason about the mathematical ideas and to grapple with what it might mean to have a measurement scale that's a percent but can add up to more than 100%. Another example, students also drew on their data visualization ideas from their math classes to analyze their schoolyard investigation data. Notice, though, that students now started to use early types of multivariate thinking. They created visualization choices and that would make a variability between groups and within groups visible. And they use these to justify their claims about the schoolyard. Here they're saying there's more bee grass, that was Bermuda grass, in the wild space. And they also started to explain this using other kinds of things they've been talking about in their science class. And by the end of this sequence, Students had many ideas about what contributed to all the variation in their measurements of their plants that they grew in their class. This distribution on the left-hand side is every measurement they took across the whole growth cycle, and students had all kinds of ideas about where these variability came from. Ideas from measurement error, ideas from time, ideas related to environmental factors, ideas related to genetics. And students picked up these ideas from their investigations and the ideas from their math classes to make claims about just how tall these Wisconsin fast plants grow. These students were using a software called Tinkerplots to create data visualizations. And they used these ideas about statistics and combining samples across classes, things that had come up both in their math and their science classes, to justify claims about population characteristics, even to change their thinking. These students here originally thought these plants grew 21 centimeters, but then after they combined with the rest of the class's data and they use some measures of center, they're starting to think now that it's somewhere between 10 and 14, maybe around 12. And last, students continued their early multivariate thinking and extended it to where some even began to create on their own marginal distributions based on periods of time across growth cycles. They used measures of center and these marginal distributions to explore growth rates of the Wisconsin fast plants. This is an example of students that used mean from 3 different groups that they created to describe the growth rate across the life cycle of the plant. So that means students were not only drawing on their mathematical explorations and the things they learned in their math class, but they were extending them to new questions and new problems, which created new mathematical thinking. So, if we think basic data fluency is an important responsibility for math education, then we have to be thinking more about how we're supporting that both inside and outside of math classes. I think this creates a lot of new questions. What's our responsibility as math education to teacher preparation, especially teachers that are not math teachers? How much time should we be allocating to data and statistics in our math classes? How do our assessments and standards support or discourage teaching about data and statistics? I think these are the kinds of questions that we have to grapple with if we're going to make progress in this hard problem. So, like I said, thank you for joining this session, and I look forward to your questions. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. Grateful for the opportunity to get to present some thinking about how we might be working in math education within math classes and outside of math classes to support students' reasoning with data. And I look forward to hearing your questions now. You can send your questions in the chat function, and I'll be looking for them and can answer them live here. There's a couple of questions that are there right now. Kristen, first of all, I totally agree that data and reasoning with data in powerful ways extends well beyond STEM fields. We've been coordinating math with science classes, but you're absolutely right. I have colleagues and know people that are doing this work across social studies, across English language arts, like you said, and that is important for us to be thinking about and considering. You have another question there that came earlier in the presentation about how we help students explain variability using things other than human error. You're right. So we start with human error because it gives them a chance to grapple with their own measurement experiences, gives them a chance to make sense of data that they have created, and to understand the game of explaining variability within a context where the variability explanation is accessible from measurement error. Later on in that presentation, we extend that across into the science classes to try and provide opportunities for students to unpack where variability comes from in terms of still measurement error, especially in the kinds of things that they're developing measurements of, like the cover of different species within their local schoolyard, but also differences from samples and locations, differences due to environmental factors, differences due to genetic factors, differences due to time and how organisms change over time. So you're absolutely right that students need explicit support to help them see that variability is not just from error. And I think that providing students opportunities to engage in those data creation processes, in mathematizing the things that they're trying to study is important, so that they can see, for example, the impact that measurement error does have, and recognize many of the differences in their data must come from something other than measurement error, because measurement error wouldn't cause a difference that big. So like I said, feel free to send any other questions in the chat, and I will monitor it here and address it as I'm able to. I'm interested to hear what you're thinking and get to share a little bit more about this work. You know, Kristen, as I'm sitting here, there's a couple of more thoughts about your question about this question of how to help students explain variability beyond just human error is so important. A couple of other things that we've been finding helpful are, first of all, organizing the whole game of data analysis as an act in explaining where the variation is coming from. But then also using data visualization to give students a chance to explore certain things like extreme values, and asking what kind of source would have caused that kind of extreme value. So for example, you know, if we've recognized that sometimes we misread our ruler whenever we measure the height of a plant, is that the kind of source of variability that could lead to the tallest plant that we measured, or is there something else going on? And that usually supports students to start to bring in other factors. Kristen, another great question. As I've been working with math and science teachers to tackle these data topics, what's the biggest lesson learned? Well, we're learning an awful lot. I would say two of the biggest lessons are, number one, how central many mathematical and statistical ideas related to data science and data models are just so important to these science teachers that we've been working with. And like you said, it's more than just science teachers, but those are who we've been working with, how important they are, and yet how little support these science teachers are given to support their students in learning to use data well, think with data well. And there's two kind of challenges that we've been trying to grapple with. One is the fact that science teachers oftentimes are interested in their students exploring relationships between variables. And for sixth grade students, for example, in their math class, everything they're doing is one variable. It's all univariate. And so how do we help science teachers develop what they need to help students start to explore those multivariable relationships? And then the second is sometimes just a matter of timing and language, helping these math and science teachers understand within their own school year how they can order and structure their sequences so that these ideas build on each other across the disciplines, how they can start to use common language. So we've been doing professional development where science teachers go and watch math classes around data. Math teachers go and watch science classes around their investigations, and they try to come to some common language to support their students. Oh, great question from Alicia. Since data visualization packages are expensive, what do you recommend teachers use in the classroom with students to get them used to using data visualization, analyzing data? I have a free answer, a wonderful data analysis tool that is great to help students visualize data called CODAP, Common Online Data Analysis Platform. It's web-based. We also have used a software called Tinkerplots, which does have a fee, but it's very cheap. CODAP is free. It's web-based, and it's designed to be interactive for students as they're learning to work with data. So lots of drag and drop features for your variables to build data visualizations, what they call dynamic data visualizations, where if you highlight certain parts of one data distribution, all those data points in your other graphs become highlighted, so you can start to look for relationships between things, things like that. So if you haven't seen that tool, go find it. If you're having trouble finding it, reach out to me personally. I'd be happy to point you to it and help you find it. Oh yes, someone just sent a link for CodeApp in the chat. That's great. Thank you, Kristen. That's great. There's also a great online community around that tool. Lots of teachers and educators in informal spaces with students too, using that tool, and they're regularly building out new features.